Thank you very much. Let me first raise a question to the panelists, and then we'll open things up for other questions and comments. And I wanted to pick up on Huang Yasheng's very interesting claim that political democratization and liberalization seems to be good for economic growth. When we look at China and India, arguing that it was in the more authoritarian period of Indian democracy that things didn't work so well, and conversely that it seems to be in the more liberal periods of PRC history that things have worked well, and try to ask the other panelists what they think of that proposition, and also what the mechanisms behind that really seem to be. After all, Yasheng, when he ended his comments, pointed out that it was under what most would consider the most authoritarian period of the PRC that much of this investment in human capital occurred, of all the investment in public health and rural education. And I mean, you clearly stated that, saying that in 1975, the difference between these two countries was very great, and that was, of course, while Mao was still alive and well before the reform era began. So thinking through what the mechanisms of this are and what it says about what the state should or shouldn't be doing. I think we can probably all agree that it's a good thing for the state to encourage investment in human capital. But what about other things that the state might be doing? Tarun, in his comments, was talking about the way in which the Indian state was targeting particular kinds of technological innovation, which reminded me of the old arguments about the East Asian developmental state, and that the advantage that Japan had, and then Taiwan, South Korea, was that you had governments who were proactively targeting, supporting, protecting various industries. And it presumably was during a fairly authoritarian period of those countries' histories that their economic growth accelerated, although you might contest that, and I'd be interested in your comments. But anyway, to just open this up a little more to the question of what is the relationship between state investment, state targeting, state meddling, and authoritarianism and democracy, and how really does this relationship between regime type or movement toward liberalization, political liberalization, and economic growth operate? And ask you for whatever thoughts you might have on that, and then we'll open things up more broadly. Do you want to start, Yasheng, and then we'll...
I think at least you are absolutely right that the human capital investment by Mao was substantial. And by the way, the Japanese investments in Korea and Taiwan, and that happened, under colonialism. So it was a very authoritarian. So I think I was so on that score. I think the authoritarianism had its usefulness. I think the main benefit was that you didn't have to care about other things, and so Cuba, for example, has a relatively good health system, but then you don't care about economic growth. You don't care about other things. So essentially, the authoritarian system is able to mobilize resources and direct in one direction more than a democracy can do. So if they chose human capital, then you get good results. There are, by the way, authoritarian governments in the world, in Africa, that didn't choose to focus and target human capital. They did other things. And there you have an unmitigated disaster. So it's a random, maybe it's not random, but it's not, authoritarianism itself is not a guarantee for human capital investment. You see very, very different patterns. Somehow in East Asia, they made that right choice. I mean, to the extent you get some productivity benefits from authoritarianism, that's the way to do that. I think there, but on the other hand, I would like to listen to people who know more about India. Is it the case that you have to do human capital investments in the way that the Chinese did in the 1950s and 1960s. And by the way, the Chinese investments in human capital then was motivated not by economic growth, but by political control, right? So for that reason, this is why Chinese literacy standard is set at 1,500 Chinese characters. As probably some of the undergraduate students at Harvard would know, if you learn 1,500 Chinese characters, you're able to read people's daily. And so that's basically why they define literacy as 1,500 Chinese characters. So it was mostly for political control. And yet, many, many years later, it had this beneficial economic growth. In Kerala, you can argue this is a communist state in India, but it's a democratic socialism, democratic communism. They have fairly good basic education system, and they didn't do it the way that the Chinese did. So even though I acknowledge the Chinese success in the 1950s and 60s, I have a problem with the view that democracies cannot do similar things. Maybe it will take a little bit longer time, maybe it will rely more help from others, but I think Kerala shows that you can do it through a democratic system.
Prasanja,
yeah, I think you posed a very important issue, and I would like to push Huasheng even further and refine your conceptions even more, so that it's not, it would be really democracy plus plus, authoritarianism plus something else too, right? So by themselves they don't do it, as we've seen. Yeah. So what are those pluses? I think it's very important to sort of try and figure it out. One thing that I have argued for a long time is that, all the East Asian states had very high mobilization, right? And you say it has to do with political control. Yes, political control is part of it, but there is also an idealism of modernization, development, whatever that was, that sort of course, it's also true that the Japanese would, in Manchuria, would, if you didn't, if you were not ready to take an injection, you might have been shot dead. So, I mean, there was that kind of, so there has to do also with it's a combination of idealism, commitment, I think. And we have to really look at those kinds of sources of commitment in these polities that early made those human capital base. I think, but at the same time, I also, and this never happened in India through all the Gandhian movement. And I am sympathetic to the Gandhian movement in some ways, that their idea was very much reconstruction of the individual, right? Of the politicization means that the individual has to become a new citizen, has to become a Swaraj and so on. It was not based entirely on mobilization in the same style that you had in the Chinese Communist Party, right? And you've never had a really strong mobilization. I mean, that concept is foreign in India. The kinds that we see in China, the patterns of types of mobilization. So I think these are very important differences, but at the same time, we see that the authoritarian mobilization also has, we have to also look at its consequences, And, with Ulrich Beck and so on now talking about second modernity, I mean, if you think first of Jim Scott's Seeing Like a State, these large projects, and second modernity, where your first round of modernization itself is now producing so many problems. You're having to sort of deal with that, whether it's from Fukushima or the Three Gorges or whatever, right? And so these things also have a huge consequence, that they have a kind of counter-finality. And that, in some ways, the slow modes might be more interesting to look at. But having said all that, I do think that the plus with Indian democracy that led to a minus is the extreme elitism, which also perhaps explains the inability to mobilize. Because the people who were supposed to do the mobilization were so linked to all the vested interests in land and so on. There wasn't that much motivation for them to do it. So some kind of revolution might have been necessary, whether from below or above or something at that point. But I know, now I don't know. I think I'm much more hopeful about Indian civil society and the possibilities that can emerge from there. There are all kinds of interesting innovations. There's one thing that I write about a lot is is an NGO that runs something called SwarNet, which means voice net, and it's in the tribal regions where the Maoist movement is very developed, where there are lots of illiterate tribals, and so they use their cell phones to lodge their complaints in a centralized website. In Bangalore, they do some translations and recirculate it so that the responsible agencies and NGOs can respond to that. So those kinds of things are doing a lot, and they have lots of hits. Okay, so I'll just leave it at that.
I don't know that I have much to say about the grand conceptual issue of democracy and growth. I think all the evidences that I'm aware of, formal evidence, suggests that it's a wash, and partly because of the, I mean, depending on how you specify your study, you get just about any result. Yeah. So I resonate with that characterization. I think there's an interesting experiment unfolding, at least in India, which is both pointing to the hopeful aspects that Prasanji just alluded to, that civil society and entrepreneurs are trying to figure out how do you get around the fact that the state continues to be asleep. How do you catalyze the state in some way? And on the one hand, you know, an optimist like myself, maybe like Prasanji would say the glass is half full, but one has to say that, you know, I think the jury's out, that we don't know how these NGOs, how their individual efforts will scale. And I haven't seen anything that leads me to be very optimistic or very pessimistic about the idea that these different experiments will somehow come together. But it's clear that ultimately that we need a catalysis of the state in some way, an awakening from its somnolescence, and somehow encouraging good human capital to go into the state, which continues not to happen.
Well, we now can call on not only the Indian state, but the audience to wake up and to feel free to raise your questions and comments. You can direct them either to a particular panelist or to all of the panelists.